got into dealing with chicken farm applications through being a member of Herefordshire branch of CPRE, which is the Campaign to Protect Rural England. I'm not a planning expert, but I've learned quite a bit about planning in the course of over 6-8 years, I think. So anyway, so I'll just give an overview of the issues to do with the farms, the context that we're in Herefordshire, and some of the main issues. And I'd like to say at the beginning that I've really only experience of the chicken farms from the view of planning. And planning is about the use of land. And I'm not an animal welfare specialist, and CPRE doesn't deal with animal welfare. There are other organisations which are much more competent at dealing with that. It's not that I don't have sympathy for the chickens, I do, but that's not my patch. So, right, well, I should say to begin with that intensive poultry farms are just one type of intensive livestock unit. Farming has changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and there's more and more instances of people going in for keeping and producing what comes out of the sheds, all sorts of livestock. There's intensive cattle units, there's intensive pig units, a number of them in Herefordshire, and there are, Helen and I discovered recently, intensive lambing units. But the most prominent one, the most frequent one that we find in Herefordshire, as we probably all know, are the intensive poultry units. Right. For poultry, why they're called intensive poultry units is the poultry can be comprised of different sorts of birds. I mean, the prevalent one in Herefordshire is chickens, though we do have some turkeys, and there's a turkey farm down on the way to Briley, on the road to near Arrowview. There's not another one very close here, but there are other turkey farms in Herefordshire. You can also have ducks, geese, and I've seen an ostrich farm once in Herefordshire. I don't know whether it still exists. But the chicken farms are the most prominent. They're intensive because of the numbers and the large numbers of buildings normally associated with large numbers of birds. We'll come on to deal with some of the details later. Any big complex, such as the ones that we have around Lions Hall, have got massive sheds with lots of chickens in. They've got biodigesters, anaerobic digesters, feed hoppers, storage sheds, all sorts of things, water tanks and everything. So the whole complex becomes very large, like a big industrial unit. And the problems that we have in Herefordshire are to do with the numbers, of course, that we're accruing, but also the topography of the county. It's full of hills, as you know, and valleys, and that does not help absorb the water that's used in chicken farms or any of the other things that come out of the chicken farms. So we'll come on to that later. So there are special problems in Herefordshire, and one of the byproducts of having so many of them is that the problems have escalated and they've got worse over the years. Right, so next slide please. Yeah. So the broiler units are very large. Most people probably know that the broilers which are reared for meat, the one-day-old chicks are taken onto the farms, thousands of them at one go, and they're put in the sheds and they're reared for roughly 6 to 7 weeks, although the time period is coming down because they're fed on food which is manufactured to increase their weight very rapidly. I mean, anybody who's kept chickens in their own backyard or runs knows that it takes a long time to get a chicken up to what they call table weight. These farms get them up in about 6 weeks, with lots of consequences, of course, for the birds. And one of the consequences of being able to do that so rapidly is that you can have a number of flocks in a year. So most of the farms have about between 7 and 8 flocks a year. But as the numbers of days have been reduced because of the way that the feed is produced, and they get them up to table weight quicker and quicker, there are examples now of them being up to table weight within 5 weeks. So that means you can have more flocks in a year, more turnover, and more profits as a result. The other type of chicken farm that we have, but they're more prevalent in Powys than they are here, are those for egg layers. They're introduced onto the farm at point of lay, and then they're kept for about 15 months laying eggs until they go off, and then they're taken away. So the turnover is not so quick. I mean, they produce eggs all the time, of course, but the turnover in terms of housing the chickens is not so frequent. It's about once every 15 months. There's usually a time span between the time when the chickens are removed from the sheds, because they need to be cleaned, washed down, disinfected, and all the rest of it. So, next slide, please. The problem, I mean, the title was, what is the problem with chicken farms in Herefordshire? It should really have been in the plural. What are the problems? Because there are many of them. Most of them emanate from the scale of the developments, the scale of the farm, the number of chickens, and the larger the farm, the worse it is. If you have one shed with a set of egg layers in it, it's not going to cause as much havoc and damage as 8 sheds with 40,000 chickens in each. So this is where the problem comes. Some farms have 8 or more sheds, each with 40,000 or more chickens in. And if you think of that happening 7 times a year with all the associated labour that's required to clean them out and everything, you can realise how the problems get escalated. During the last, since the year 2000, since the millennium really, the number of chicken farms in Herefordshire has increased enormously. It's also increased hugely in Shropshire, and it's also increased in Powys, although the number of broiler farms proportionately in Powys are much less. They have many more egg layers than we do, partly because of the terrain, partly for other reasons. But it's reckoned now that Shropshire and Herefordshire combined have about up to 30 million birds at any one time in the sheds. So we're surrounded by these things. So the impacts of these chicken farms are primarily, in sort of general terms, environmental. You get problems from the birds themselves. They produce manure, they produce ammonia in their manure, they produce carbon dioxides, they smell. Anybody who lives near them knows how badly they smell. There's also problems which are created in the environment in terms of how they're provisioned. Huge numbers of vehicles come on and off the sites. They have to bring food, they have to bring litter, they have to take away dead birds, they have to bring the chicks, they have to take away the other chicks, and then all the people coming in and out, cleaning the sheds and everything. The number of vehicles that come on and off the farms, they are all emitting unpleasant things too. So the atmosphere is contaminated, polluted, both by the chickens and by the way in which they're serviced. The other thing that has happened is, when I put up in the slide, is that as a consequence of the way that they're fed, there's enormous areas of deforestation in South America. The chickens don't go around picking up corn, like, or stuff that you chuck over the fence if you've got domestic chickens. They're fed on very, very tightly controlled manufactured food. In fact, Avara, Cargill, who have the processing plant in Hereford, deal with the chickens and produce the meat, also have the food, manufacture the food to provide the farms. And a very large proportion in terms of the weight of the food and the content is soya, which is grown in South America. Avara have large concessions of land in South America, and the forests have been demolished in order to produce that. When you think of the consequences, it's not just deforestation, it's importing the food from South America, large quantities, which are shipped to England, then transported from the ports to the farms via the feed mills. So there are a good deal of consequences because of that. Sorry, thank you. They're also very heavy users of water. Chickens drink water, and the sheds are set up so that they've got drinking points all the way up and down the lines. But huge quantities of water are needed to clean the sheds out at the end of each of the flocks. And the consumption of water is really very large on these farms. And those of you who know anything about the application in Lions Hall at the moment will know that people are concerned about where the water is going to come from, because there's no main supply there. There's a possibility that they're going to have to dig their own borehole, which will deplete the water resources of everybody else who uses boreholes in the same place. They occupy land, of course, and although in terms of the total acreage of a farm, the land use for the sheds and all the infrastructure is perhaps not very great. The whole thing becomes an area of completely concreted over, concrete basis for the sheds, concrete basis for the surrounding areas for the lorries and everything else. And it's not used for anything else. If a chicken farm ceases, you may occasionally see an application for the land to be used for something else, but it has to be decontaminated. It has to, if you want to grow anything on it, it will take masses of concrete up and everything, so it's wasted land in that sense. The chickens pollute the atmosphere, as does the traffic, and it affects the health of people. It's not just the smell, but it's all sorts of things get dispersed in the atmosphere. Plants and animals lots of plants are poisoned as a result of the ammonia, and animals, small insects, butterflies, and everything that depend on crops depend on them for being fertilized, can be destroyed by ammonia. The health of people that lives nearby is very often jeopardized by the dust and the fumes from chicken farms. And worst of all, well, not worst of all, I shouldn't say that, but one of the big polluting issues to do with the chicken farms is the chemicals that are excreted by the chickens and are in their feces. Chicken manure contains a higher proportion of phosphates than any other stock that's kept on farms. And a lot of the phosphates are not easily soluble. It's used, the chicken manure is used as a fertilizer by farms, and it mounts up year after year after year. Because it doesn't get absorbed into the rather clayey kind of soil that we get here, and when we get heavy rainfall, it just washes away, gets into the watercourses. and as we know, it pollutes the ditches, the streams, the rivers and everything else. It kills, it coats the bottoms of the streams so that the fish don't spawn, and it often is toxic to a number of plants. In the Y, it's killed off all the, it's killing off all the plants which are necessary for a lot of bird and insect life, and it's killing off some very interesting and rather rare plant species as well. Can we go to the line? Right. What's special about chicken farms in Herefordshire? We all live in Herefordshire, which is what we're talking about in partly. But it is the numbers of chicken farms across Herefordshire. Can you put the map up, please? When I first got into dealing...
sorry, how did I get that?
Sorry. I asked the planning office whether they could tell me where all the other chicken farms were. Could I have a copy of their record? And they had no, they have records of all the permissions that have been given, but they don't categorise them in any way. So they had no, some officers perhaps had an idea where chicken farms were, but there was no published information about the distribution of chicken farms in Herefordshire. So other people in Shropshire were also concerned about this, and our sister organisation in Powys, CPRW, the Brecon and Radler group, were also extremely concerned. So together we got all the information, we trawled the planning lists, and we mapped the incidence of chicken farms. Now the maps that are available are not totally up to date. I think the last year, 18 months are probably not on, but you do see how infected Herefordshire is with chicken farms. And I've got copies, I've printed off some, which actually show the three counties together. And it is, it's really extremely worrying. The large number in the marshes, and as a consequence the pollution levels in the rivers have got worse. I'm accused of putting causes where there is no proof of cause. But it is a coincidence that the increase in the pollution in the rivers has occurred alongside the increase in the number of chicken farms in Herefordshire, in Shropshire and in Powys. The River Wye and the River Lug, River Lug has been over its phosphate targets for 10 or more years, and the targets have, and the levels have not gone down, they've increased. Recent work that's been done has shown, in fact, that farming in general pollutes the rivers a great deal, and it's admitted now even by the Environment Agency that something like 60 to 70% of river pollution is caused by farming, not necessarily chicken farms alone, but diffuse farming. There's a great deal of mud goes into the rivers, as you know, and partly because of the practice now, there was a period when hedges were ripped up, the buffer strips that existed don't exist anymore, and with the increase in arable farming in areas in Herefordshire, mud gets washed into the rivers. We've all seen heavy rainfall and tried to get our cars through mud on the roads. That all fish, in the end, goes into watercourses and trickles down into the river, full of contamination very often. Arable fields are full of all sorts of chemicals that have been put on them, unless it's a purely organic farm. So the why, and all it's been shown recently by a project which CPRE is involved in testing the rivers. There are points at which people are abstracting bits of water and putting them through particular testing. All the tributaries to the Wye are contaminated, as are all the tributaries of the Lug, and the Lug is the major tributary of the Wye, of course. So we've got a serious, serious problem in Herefordshire. It's been building up for years, and there's been very little effort to do anything about it. They now got alarmed about it because they've been prevented from doing any more building or doing anything within the catchment areas of the Wye and the Lug, unless it can be proved that that development is not going to contaminate the river or the watercourses any further than they're contaminated already. They've got to produce professionally assessed scientific evidence. So there's a moratorium really on building. And it's the main cause of the loss of wildlife. There are hardly any salmon in the river now. They can't spawn. The number of birds have depleted. Other fishing has been really, really badly affected. Why has it been allowed to happen? Inertia, pressure from people who make money out of it. There are no embargoed spots in Herefordshire. If you look carefully at some of the maps that we've been able to draw, you will see that a lot of the chicken farms are very close to watercourses. So there's not even any strategic planning in Herefordshire saying where it is least dangerous to put the chicken farm. Now it may be that they may be refused in a particular location because they aren't able to satisfy the very stringent or fairly stringent requirements of the environmental impact assessment which they're supposed to do. However, there are a good many times when in fact people seem to gloss over some of the problems that the environmental impact assessment has shown up. But you find clusters, and clusters near the rivers. We all know that there's a cluster, or most people know that there's a big cluster around Lions Hall, and that's not very far distant from us. It's a county of hills and valleys, and there's been an interesting study which has compared the effect of the chicken farms on the watercourses in Herefordshire and Shropshire with those of in East Anglia. There are areas in Norfolk where there's quite a lot of chicken farms. In fact, they're probably as dense as they are here in terms of the whole land mass that's taken up by them. But it's flat land, the soil is different, and they do not have the same level of problems with contaminated watercourses. The study showed that there's a problem with the topography of Herefordshire, which encourages, it allows water to go down into the rivers. There's also a problem with the soil in that it doesn't absorb the phosphates, and Helen will come and talk a bit more about that later, I think. The other problem is that if you get chicken farms in clusters, then of course the problems become accentuated. You get what is called a cumulative impact. And anybody who lives in Lions Hall will have experienced some of the problems associated with that. And that is partly because each planning application gets judged as a single application. It's only very recently that some pressure has been put on the planning authority to look at cumulative impact. That is, how many other farms are there in the area? Is the ammonia from farm A going to be added to that of farm B, to farm C, and so on? What about the traffic? The traffic increase in a smallish area, when you've got, I reckon, 8 chicken farms of a large size surrounding Lions Hall, means that you've got 8 times the large number of heavy goods vehicles that come in and off farms. So you get clusters, you get almost poisoned areas, I would say. The landscape is affected. Sorry,
I'm sorry.
There
I
is
was
a
dreading you
clause
saying
in Herefordshire's local plan, which is what it's got policies which govern and which officers have to look at to see whether planning application is permissible or not. And many of you will have come across this. There is not supposed to be large industrial developments within the open countryside. Policy RA6 it's called. So if you want to put a factory on the hillside where I live, you wouldn't be allowed to. In fact, you can't even put a house there unless you can show that it's essential for agricultural purposes, probably new house. However, chicken farms are exempt from this because they're considered to be a necessary diversification of farming. Now I know that farmers need to think about different ways of doing things, but there are other options open to people. And in fact, the large chicken farms are really only developed by people who have money. It costs a great deal of money to put a big chicken farm together. You will see small farmers, and this is partly the difference between Herefordshire and Paris. Some small farmers may put up one, maybe two sheds of egg layers. Even that's quite expensive for people, and they may have to borrow money. But when you put 6 or 8 large sheds, each containing 40,000 broilers, feeding them and all the rest of it, it costs a great deal of money, millions, but they make millions of money out of it too. So I think there is a problem. They're deemed to be necessary diversifications. Well, some of the applications, such as the one at Green Farm in Lions Hall, is certainly not a diversification. It's on a small piece of land which was bought explicitly to develop a chicken farm. The environmental regulations say that chicken farms, large chicken farms, they categorise them as being equivalent in terms of their environmental impact, that is, the damage that they can cause, alongside nuclear power stations and large port developments, aerodromes and so on. So it's absurd. I mean, to me it seems absurd that chicken farms could get away with being allowed to be in open countryside. And the other telling thing about them, I think, is that because they are farms, they are not charged any rates. They're not charged any business rates, and yet they make millions of money, millions of pounds every year. They're excluded from being required to pay any contributions if they're allowed a development. Some of you will know about the so-called 106 contribution. If you build 6 or 10 houses, the developer has to pay a certain amount. It's a sort of tax to the council, and the council then uses it to support schools and all sorts of other things. Chicken farms making millions of money, millions of pounds a year, are not taxed in any way, and nor are farm vehicles. Farm vehicles don't pay any road tax. So in the end, we're all subsidising them.
Yeah, right.
Right, the last time, please. So I've got 3 questions really, which I thought you might like to consider, and you can perhaps discuss them afterwards. Should there be a campaign to change the status of intensive poultry units? That is, not that they should not any longer be considered as farm diversifications. They should be considered as industrial units and treated accordingly, and maybe placed on industrial sites. Now that would require government legislation, because it's not just the Herefordshire County Council that considers them that, it is a national legislation that would be required, but we could always stop the campaign. Another suggestion I have is that before the current Herefordshire local plan, the core strategy, we had something which was called the Military Development Plan. Now, the core strategy is actually being reviewed at the moment and devised. Before the core strategy, we used to have a policy in the old plan which said that you could not have a chicken farm within 400 metres of where people live, and nor could you build a house within 400 metres unless it was associated with the farm. So it did protect people to a certain extent. However, it was quietly dropped when the new plan came in, I suspect because the farming lobby was very strong. And it seems to me highly desirable that we should have it reinstated with the core strategies being reviewed. And anyway, we will have a new local plan within a few years. I suggest that it gets put back in again, maybe even made more strong. The other problem is that for years and years, as I said, the love has been contaminated and the Y is now contaminated also, and it's national disgrace. The Y is what they call an SAC, which is the highest category really that should be afforded protection to a site. The LUG is an SSSI, a site of special scientific interest, that also should have protection. And Herefordshire has failed to protect either of these. Largely, I have to say, I think through inertia and the feeling that, well, it doesn't really matter all that much. However, it does matter now because external forces have required that no more development can take place within the catchment area of these rivers until something is done to address the problem. And that's affecting all sorts of economic developments and construction firms and so on, and housing. So until Herefordshire gets its act, and Shropshire get their act together and do something about policy about the pollution in the rivers, should we not have a moratorium that there should be no more chicken farms until the problem is sorted out? Right.